everybody. This is James Diboe and Discovering, dedicated to original peoples, and we've got a special guest on, local activist, historian, Jimi Jagne. How are you doing, my brother? Great to have you on.
It's fantastic to be here, James. You know, I've been following what you've been doing with these podcasts for quite some time. I know that they're the talk of the town. People, including myself, you know, very proud of what you're doing. And, you know, it's a big up to you. And, you know, it's great after so long as well to be here and invited to participate, you know. I'm looking forward to this interview.
Excellent. You know, it's great to have you on. And you've got a lot of history over 40 years, you know, local activist. And I know you deal with the L8 riots, 81 riots, and there's many other things that you're involved with as well. If you could give us a little bit of a background here from how it all began. How did it all begin for you to even get into activism, become a local historian? You know, it's been a long journey for you, I can definitely see. You give us a little bit of a background on your begin, Jimmy. How did you come into this?
You know, my story is very similar to most people, you know, who've ended up, you know, doing what I've been doing over the years. People my age and older found themselves living in a situation where our living circumstances were definitely best described as being ghetto. And I don't mean that in any cliched sense of the word. I mean, literally, you know, our circumstances were ghetto life. And not wanting to go on too long about this, but, you know, the forces that come to bear when you grow up in a situation where you're living in a ghetto, everybody knows, you know, that, you know, there's problems with poverty, you know, poor housing, you know, your parents quite often are unemployed. Your family is large and you're living in a small house with, you know, that's poorly resourced, and you're going and you know, you're encountering racism left, right, and center. But the most important thing to understand about being ghettoized is that you are hemmed into your corner. This is the most important thing. Lots of people go through all the different circumstances that I've just given you as examples. But the one thing that you don't experience unless you live in a ghetto situation is that you're hemmed in. What I mean by that is that it's kind of a form of segregation. You find that you're living in houses, in streets with the same people. You're not allowed to live anywhere else. All of your people are under the same cosh. You know, it's very difficult to find work. It's very difficult to earn money. It's very difficult to eat. Your children get sent to the same schools. You're denied and cut off from opportunities and access to other resources outside of the community. So, you know, the expectation that, you know, you can go to school and aspire to go to university one day and get yourself a nice job, that wasn't the everyday thing back then. That was something that white people did, you know, and we used to talk openly about that being the truth. And so that was the start in life, very basically. And then, you know, there were other things that would happen, you know, such as events and incidents that would come to your doorstep. So one of the things that I found, apart from having to go to school and contend with racism on a daily basis, and also find that if I ventured into a neighboring, you know, district, that I'd get chased or run out or abused or called names or get stones thrown at me, things that have happened to me and others my age, you know, on a very regular basis. You'd have incidents that would actually arrive on your doorstep, such as having to contend with the police or skinheads, you know, who venture into the neighborhood. The National Front used to march along Parliament Street, you know, frequently. And I, by this time in my late teens, was a Rastafarian by that point of time. And there were a lot of things that would happen to me culturally, you know, in terms of, you know, ensuring my own personal safety, in terms of the development of my cultural awareness and consciousness at the earliest point of time in my life. And, you know, and also developing a political conscience as well. You know, the idea that, you know, you have to take a stand and you have to do something about your situation. And so, you know, the first, you know, situation where I found myself in, where I was, you know, actually being political, if you like, was, you know, hanging out with Rastafarian friends and talking about, you know, how we objected to the fact that, you know, you'd have, you know, the National Front marching, you know, through our neighborhood. And along with other people, along with other black people in our community, who were older than us. Usually it'd be as early Saturday afternoon. We'd wait to ambush these marchers, and of course there'd be throngs of police, marching with them, protecting them, literally protecting them. And when we attacked, these marchers, we'd throw stones at them, we'd run them or whatever else. The police, would go to great lengths, to grab hold of any number of us that they could get and arrest us. And it's important to remember, that the marches were very provocative, and these National Front marchers hadn't just arrived to walk through peacefully. They were there to provoke us. They were there to antagonize us. They were there to, abuse us and call us racist names. So, it was a two-way deal. And when fighting would break out between us and marchers, the police were always keen to get their hands on us, but they were not at all interested in grabbing hold of any of these marchers. So, this was happening to me when I was age of 15. Even I think my first march attack was something like when I was just late 14, about to turn 15. So this was in the very late 70s, late 1978 going into 1979. And then, of course, you touched on the uprising that took place in 1981. Well, it was important to talk about the things that I've just mentioned before I mentioned 81, because 81 was the culmination of all of these things. By the time in 1981 came, I and my friends and other Rastafarians I was one of the youngest ones. I was 17 years of age, as were a few other friends. But then there were older people as well who were involved up until the early to mid 20s. And, we'd all gone through the same experiences. We'd all been stopped by police officers on dark corners in the middle of the night on our own streets, by the way, for doing nothing other than being black and walking through our neighborhood to get from one place to another. We'd all experienced the situation. We were being slapped around, provoked into an incident so that the police could ultimately get to the point where they could arrest you. So there was often violence. There was often rummaging through your pants and your underwear looking for, wraps of weed and whatnot, particularly if you were Rastafarian, because, of course, the suspicion was that if you were Rastafarian, you were carrying weed on you. So they'd always rummage through your underwear, your pockets, take your hat off, your tam off, mess up your head, grab you by your hair, and they'd be poking you in the chest, shoving you against the wall, referring to you as Sambo, black boy, N-word, all the rest of it, anything to get you wound up so that you get to the point where you'd lose your temper. And once you lose your temper, that's the point of arrest. And if you raise your hand, even to defend yourself against a blow, the idea was that you were attempting to assault a police officer. You'd be dragged into a vehicle, you'd get the beating of your life, taken to a police station. And if they could make the charges stand, they charge you with assaulting police officer. And once you appear in court with that on your record, you're going to jail. So, come 1981, we were pissed off with all of this. And the most important thing to say about the uprising and its eventuality is that it was not a spontaneous moment. It was not motivated out of criminal opportunity or the desire to get to just cause trouble and kick off. There was an inevitable set of circumstances that had always been kicking into play before the uprising happened. And Wally Brown famously said in an interview many years ago, when he described, when he was talking himself about the uprising and the fact that it happened, it was like the spark that ignited on the tinderbox that ignited the fire. So there was an inevitability about it that had been going on for many, many years. And just so that people understand, there have been many, many attempts made on behalf of young people in our community by community leaders in our organization, not least of all the Merseyside Community Relations Council. They would actually meet with the Chief Constable and his office almost on a monthly basis at times for the best part of 10 years to warn people that, number one, complaints have been coming into the organization from concerned parents that their children were being systematically harassed and picked on and put on false charges, given beatings and sent to court, and even having to go to approved school or detention centers and places like this. Kids were being systematically criminalized simply because they were black. And concerned parents were going and complaining about this. The CRC had deep caseloads of such cases. The Cooper family were one very good case and example. And as I said, this had been going on for a long time, and the CRC I know the community leaders would have regular meetings with the chief constable's office, for years, forewarning that there could be an incident that could take off at any point of time. Violent situation could happen at any point of time on our streets, and that the best thing that the chief constable could do was think more carefully about sensitive policing. If policing had to be done, then they could try to engage the community on more, reasonable grounds. This whole idea of just like dragging kids off the street who just walking through their own neighborhood had to stop, and it didn't. And so,
Jimmy,
the uprising was inevitable as it happened.
Now, Jimmy, I heard you say about Rastafarian before. You were a part of that. Now, was you a part of? Because I heard this movement a long time ago about the 12 tribes. Was you a part of the 12 tribe movement? And another thing I need to ask you as well is when you were saying that a lack of jobs, like you were saying before. It's funny that like we have a lack of jobs back in the day, but also I heard about a lot more black businesses were thriving a lot more in the community than today. So what I mean by that is we have a big decline on black businesses. It's a massive decline. So when it comes to, I mean, I got told by the elderly about there's about 40 nightclubs, black people have about 40 nightclubs. I'm just for example. So as far as being self-employed, and there was a lack of jobs. Do you think the lack of jobs made it more showed us that we should start our own businesses? If you know what I mean.
I think, I mean, it's an interesting question. I've not been asked specifically about black businesses back in the day before. The one thing that I would like to stress is that our community has always been a multicultural one, in the sense that there's always been different types of people living here. Of course, there's that period from the late 1960s through to the late 80s, early 90s, when the community's flavor, if you like, overwhelming flavor, was one of being a prominently black community. But in fact, there have always been different types of people living here. And of course, before we came here, there were a lot of white people here. It was mainly white people. So it didn't matter whether they were English, whether they were Jewish, whether they were Italian, Turkish, whatever. Before we came here up the road from Upper Pitt Street and Chinatown Way, this place was occupied by white people, and they not only had homes, they had businesses. And so when I was born in 1964 and going into the early 70s, and I was being brought to Granby Street in particular for the first time with family members to shop, it was a thriving mecca of all sorts of different businesses. Granby Street looked then like nothing what it is now.
Now, when we say business, I understand different peoples within the community, but I just want to focus on black people's.
Of course,
So with the black businesses, did you notice it more thriving than it is today? And I'm not just talking about only like barbershops, because we have a lot of black barbershops still to this day. Did you notice a lot more black businesses, would you say, compared to now?
In short, not particularly. I know that there were some people who did have black people who did have businesses, but the reason why I mentioned what I did was because I found at that point in my life, when I was a young kid coming here for the first time to Granby Street, that shops were owned overwhelmingly by white people.
Okay.
That's why I was explaining what I did.
Right.
I'm saying that, it wasn't a case of white businesses coming into the neighborhood, although you did have some of those. The day-to-day shops, like grocers, fruit people, chandlers, whatever, seemed to be run by and large by white people, whether that was here on Granby Street or Lodge Lane. Although there were black businesses, I would say myself personally, in answer to your question directly, I'd say for the whole 40 years since then or whatever, I'd say that the situation with black business ownership has generally been the same. And I mean, now you go to Lodge Lane, and the Arab community seem to own most of the businesses on Lodge Lane. Yeah. Again, there are black people who have the odd business, but I tend to find that black businesses, the main issue with them is that they don't last very long. Certainly the commercial enterprises anyway.
Also, let me add on, when I say black businesses, also allow me to add on being a homeowner, because it seemed like a house was a lot cheaper going back, and there was certain people, whether you come from the Caribbean or whether you come from Africa, people who see the importance of own property. as well. When I say business, I want to include property as well.
Yeah.
Where nowadays it just seems like the houses are so expensive, it can be much difficult to get, a mortgage sometimes. So I knew like a couple of people who had ownership of our houses going way back, and I don't know, maybe a lot of people sold, different reasons and that. And also, please allow me I want to know how the Rastafarian as well, if we could deal with that as well, because I think that's very interesting. What gravitated you towards Rastafarian also?
Yeah, I mean, the Rastafarian thing is a big deal to me, and I would like to talk about that as much as I can. Let me deal with the housing question first.
Okay.
I think you're absolutely right. There is a difference between now and then. It's interesting because economically, families have access to earning opportunities more so today than they did back then. But the irony is, the quality of the houses around here was slum-like. And nobody outside the community was interested in buying a house here. Obviously nobody wanted to move into a ghetto, but not that it was easily achieved, but I did find, without learning what the circumstances were for them being able to get hold of those houses, I was just a small boy, but I'd visit lots of families' houses, and it could be an African family or it could be a Caribbean family. It didn't seem to make much difference. The house ownership between them seemed to be the same. Some African families and some Caribbean families didn't own houses. Our own home was not owned. We rented a home, and that seemed to be the case with most people. But there were definitely families, friends of mine, whose families owned their home, and they were big 3-story houses.
Yeah.
They weren't nice. They weren't nice, fancy houses. Don't get me wrong. If you went into the kitchen or whatever else, of course, Black families being what they were fantastic people at making the best of the circumstances. So these homes were always clean. They were always respectable. They were always well kept, but they were modest, But that it struck me that you had all these potential playing spaces in these houses because there was loads of rooms on loads of floors. And you could literally go into a part of the house and nobody would know that you're there because the house is so big, So we lived on Edgerton Street, the part of Edgerton Street that's been knocked down for so many decades now. And we lived in a 3-story house. It was rented, but, it was a great house because you could have adventures in there as a small kid, But you're right, James. For some reason, and I think it's probably to do with the fact that certainly over the past few years, this part of Liverpool 8, when I say this part, I mean Princess Road, Granby, just before you get to Lodge Lane, it's been gentrified quite a bit in the sense that, housing associations have taken over, and the council have made certain properties that were, done up over recent years available to developers, and they're selling them at exorbitant prices now. And so it's much more difficult, for people to buy houses, who want to stay living in Liverpool 8. I think there's a lot of
and the prices as well, and the prices as well, because my grandfather, he bought a house for £500 back in the 50s.
Yeah.
Still owns it now, So that's what's interesting. The house prices. I mean, he would have thought they'd go skyrocket up,
Well, back in the day, as I say, when you're living in a ghetto, man, you only see one direction, and it's not up.
Yeah.
I never ever. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to gloss over the story at all. I'm not trying to suggest for one moment that we have a nirvana here or some kind of utopia. We don't. I contend, and I still like to speak, and I still like to get out and get involved with things because I believe that there's all sorts of issues that we still have to sort out as a community. But having said that, it seems to me that people have more options these days. I don't describe Liverpool 8 as a ghetto anymore. I don't really think that it's been a ghetto in the true sense, certainly since the mid-1990s. I think that there's been a certain level of gentrification here, and now it's still a multicultural community. But the interesting thing is, I find that there's a lot of white middle class people here, the sort of people who would never have moved here when we were really struggling. And people have their own ideas and their own views about that, and that's fine. I just recognize that change happens, and that change to me is a significant one. and because it tells you, well, a lot about the perception of this place as a living space.
Yes, so interesting anyway, no one obviously could predict the prices that were going to go up,
No.
But your Rastafarian movement, though, because I heard this a few times with a few different peoples and that, I'm sure Bob Marley was a big, massive influence there. And what was it? Was it an identity thing as well?
Listen, James, I hope you're going to give me plenty of time with this one, because I can talk about Rastafarianism all day. I was fortunate enough last year, October of last year, to have published a book with Professor Stephen Small, a great friend of mine, and I'd like to talk about him a bit later on as well. We co-authored a book together. It's only a small book for those who haven't seen it or come across it yet. It wasn't intended to be a book, actually. It's just a set of articles that we've written, but somebody in Leicester was impressed with what we'd written and decided to publish the book. And I devoted one of the chapters that I wrote to Rastafarianism. So I feel really strongly, first of all, that Rastafarians have never been given the credit that they're due as a community people. And I haven't been a Rastafarian myself in the 70s and early 80s. My life was shaped largely by my experience of moving with Rastas, being able to reason with them and learn, all the things that we used to talk about together. As I mentioned before, the Black liberation struggle throughout the entire diaspora is one of the great shaping forces in my life. Without learning the things that I learned when I was a youth about it, I don't think I'd be the person that I am today. And I don't think I would have been involved with the activities and the things that I've achieved for myself today without that knowledge, without that without that drive and motivation, and without the passion, for recognizing the contribution of the people who suffered so much so that we could live better. And being with the Rastafarians was the starting point for me. When I was at school, I became a victim of racism. I was walking around, with a head, like a lot of other Black kids who wouldn't care to admit it at the time, but there was a kind of half shame to being Black. You felt very strongly that, it was a white man's world, that you were secondary to it. To take your footsteps in life meant that you always had to be looking over your shoulder and being concerned about what the white man thought of you. This is very true, James. I felt as though my mind had become blitzkrieged. I was always a conscientious kid in the sense that I wanted to go to school. I knew that that they did not want me to do well, but I was always determined that I wanted to do well at school and make a future for myself. I had all those very simple ideas that my grandfather instilled in me: work hard at school, be principled, develop integrity and always be true to yourself, and try and work hard and do well for yourself, because no one's going to give you anything. But this became a problem for me because it didn't give me, it didn't empower me with anything. It meant that I had a lot of things to try and achieve with my life, but I didn't feel empowered in any way. And the thing that was always dragging me down was going to school, being racially abused by kids, being racially abused by teachers, coming out of school, making my way home, being racially abused by white people if I had to walk through another district, being chased with stones. Then there was the police being picked up at the age of 12 and dumped in speaker, made to walk home in the dark with my clothes wringing wet after being flung in a puddle of mud. And for why? Just for walking home in my school uniform with my school bag, with my books. So I got to the point where I was thinking, well, is there something wrong with me just because I'm damn Black? What is it about this business about the color of my skin? I don't trouble anybody. Why should I carry this? It feels like a burden. You understand me? And so I was not getting anything positive to counter the effects of that blitzkrieg, and with the benefit of hindsight, in retrospect, I felt that I was going through, I can look back and feel sure that if I didn't have an intervention of some sort, God knows where I'd end up in my life as far as the condition of my mind goes and what kind of things I'd be doing to survive. But then when I was 14, I ran into, a kid who I used to hang out with when we were small. We used to hang out when we were 10 and 11 and all this. I hadn't seen him in some time. And I'd watched Top of the Pops like most other kids. And I'd noticed that there was this singer, Bob Marley, with dreadlocks and stuff. He had what to me seemed like funny hair. How did he get his hair like that? It looks like weird plaits, man, you know what I mean? But it don't look like plaits. But I didn't know what a Rasta was. I'd never heard of Rastafarianism. I'd only heard him singing his songs, and some of the songs were about peace and love, but other things referred to Jah and, you know, and the promised land and things like this. And I never knew what any of that meant. But anyway, I ran into this friend that I used to hang out with when I was a kid, and it was Errol Graham.
Okay.
And he had dreadlocks, man.
Interesting, because Errol Graham was one of the people I was thinking of speaking about. There was a few people part of the 12 tribes. Yeah,
Well, then 12 tribes, I know you asked that before, and I'll come to that. 12 tribes didn't figure at the time, at this moment. But when I saw him, it was quite an interesting time because, you know, we had a bit of catching up to do and we stood on the street talking. But of course, I gravitated towards his hairstyle. He had a big tam on as well. And I was like, what is all this about, man? You know, you look like this guy, Bob Marley, man. You know what I mean? Yeah. And he started to explain, you know, what it was all about and where it was coming from. And it sounded really strange to me because I had no idea that he was going to talk to me about religion. And I've never really been a religious person. You know, I went to Catholic school, and it didn't mean anything to me. You know, they were presenting, you know, an image of a white Jesus Christ to me with blonde hair and blue eyes. And even at that little age, you know, without being too conscious about anything else, you know, I realized, well, hold on a minute. You're telling me that this guy was born in the Middle East. And, you know, he's running around a whole heap of Arab-looking people and Jewish-looking people. And yet he looks like the guy who comes in to teach me maths. You know what I mean? So I knew there was something wrong there, and it wasn't really
sense. Yeah, of course, because looking at the image, you know, how can this be the savior, like you say? It looks like the teacher in your class or some hippie kind of guy, you know?
Yeah.
Definitely.
And it really resonates with you, James, because just speaking to those, you may be one of these people as well, just speaking to those who've never been to a Catholic school. Catholic school is very different from going to a Church of England school because you have to pray. You know, they pray in the assembly before school starts. They take you to church, you have to pray in school. And I'm talking about you go on your knees, you join your hands like this, and you're in front of a statue or a picture of this image of Christ. And you have to pray and worship him and say, he is the savior, he's the one who's this and that. You know what I mean? And say, praise our Father. So you are prostrating yourself to a white image of a God. You understand? And that is a very, very powerful thing for a child to have to go through and be brought up with. And yet there's no question about where you fit in with all that as a black youth.
Well, you can clearly see that will install not self-love, it'll install self-hate, because now you're looking at the white savior rather than your own image of your own people or your own ancestors.
This meeting is being recorded.
Yeah, so basically, you know, it's always about this savior of a foreign savior where we can't look to our own people as the solution, the answer. So I find this a lot of places, especially being a traveling man and traveling many different places. I'm on the search for the original peoples wherever they go on this planet. I recognize Africa as the birthplace of humanity, but at the same time, there are still pockets of black peoples, even in large numbers, some places that people might not recognize as black peoples. So when I'm going into Asia, I go into the South Pacific, Australia, I'm recognizing that these are the original peoples of these lands, you know. So we get like a whitewash, like you might go on, like, I feel like the TV, especially, that's how we began with the TV before we even had the internet. Everyone likes to show you whitewash versions of a Native American. Everyone likes to show you whitewash version of even people in the Pacific Islands, people in Asia. Do you know what I'm saying? So this colorism problem of white supremacy is spread around the world. I mean, even like India, the caste system, this goes way back, and it's like it's been reintroduced when the British have gone into theirs and stuff. So this is why it's important, why I'll deal with original peoples. So we need our own savior, and it's a reflection of ourselves. So when you were in school growing up, Jimmy, what did they teach you about Black history as far as you knew? And you gravitating toward Rastafarian and then, you know, leaders into the 12 tribes movement as well, to get, you know, capturing an identity of oneself. You could explain, Jimmy.
Well, I know you've heard the first part of this answer from many people many times before, because we all basically tell the same story. We got no teachings of Black history in school. We got no teachings of Black history anywhere in the mainstream, in fact. So you could switch on your TV, you could pick up a newspaper, you could read a magazine, you could watch a film. Everything was colored white. Everything was from a white perspective. The only time you saw Black people mentioned or heard Black people being mentioned was in school. They were usually running around being civilized by superior white people in a jungle situation. Or on TV, they were usually the bad guy, the criminal who was like, pimping prostitutes and being chased by police officers. In newspapers, the stories about Black communities were nothing to do with the fantastic way, that means and results that we were coming up with, to survive and to better ourselves as a community people. The stories were all about, well, here we go again, deprivation, no good people up to no good because they can't achieve anything better for themselves. They need us to sort out their situation. So everything was downward in terms of a perspective about Black people. And the overwhelming impression that you got was that, well, we had no history anyway that was worth talking about because it stunk, and if there was going to be a history that was going to be talked about, it was how we needed white people to make our lot better. So, I used to read a lot of books when I was a kid. I was a very nerdy type of kid in that respect. I used to love reading books, but none of them told me anything about Black. None of them. They were all, in many respects, I enjoyed reading those books. They switched on my mind and my imagination, but I wasn't being engaged as a Black person. You understand me? So, in fact, if anything, I was aspiring to be a colorblind person. Not necessarily embracing white, but not being Black either. Just a person without an identity. I just wanted to be a clever kid, intelligent as anybody else, but with no sense of direction or purpose about it. And this is where we come back to Rastafari again, because these guys, I cannot say enough about the debt that I owe to being a young Rastafarian. I met up, as I started to explain before, I ran into Errol. He basically said to me, well, listen, come on, let's listen to some music together. Come to some of the places that I go to and meet some of the guys who I hang with now. Listen to some of the things that we talk about. And Errol, as I know, he's been on at least a couple of these podcasts. And Errol has always been a very spiritual-minded young guy, very conscious. And it's awesome, the extent to which he studied theology, and he's made sure that when he talks about Rastafari and the religious aspects of it, that he can he can validate everything. He's got the evidence, he's got the historical knowledge, and he explains it and articulates it all so beautifully. But he's always had that passion, he's always had that feel, and he was interested in getting me into that, and of course I gave that side of it a go for a short time. But I found myself becoming less interested in the spiritual aspect and much more interested in the stuff that we were learning when we listened to these records, because we were listening to great artists like Burning Spear. Not only Bob Marley, but Burning Spear was someone who really struck me very powerfully as being someone I could relate to. These guys were talking about what it was to be Black. And they would talk, and they were making references to freedom fighters, of old, both in the Caribbean and Africa. So I'd learn about great names like Patrice Lumumba. I'd learn about Paul Bogle. I'd learn about Marcus Garvey. I'd learn about Queen Nanny of the Maroons. I'd learn about all these people who struggled at different times in different contexts for different freedoms and rights and justice. And it was the answer to everything for me at that time in my life, because I realized a number of important things that I've been missing for so long. Number one was that all this racism stuff, it didn't just happen to me. It seemed to happen to anybody who was living in the diaspora. And the one thing we all had in common was that we were Black, and we could all say our ancestors were African. And then I realized, this slavery thing didn't just exist in isolation. It wasn't some kind of like thing that popped up out of the blue because Black people were ripe for the picking. There's a whole history that preceded slavery there's a whole condition that belonged to Africans that was natural to them, and it was abused. It was exploited, and it was manipulated by these Europeans who then brought their slavery. And ever since slavery, the story for Black people, by and large, is being about resisting the legacy of it. And I'm trying to determine, to find some kind of reparatory justice in all of it and restore ourselves back to a situation where we can be something like what we had been previously prior to slavery. And so I learned all this just listening to records, and I was absolutely mind blown because I thought, I belong to a tradition of resistance here, man. This is important. We're not here to just lie on the ground and roll over and take all this. You got to fight, man. You got to do something. Go take matters into your own hand. And you got an advantage. You belong to one of the biggest, most numerous community of people there is on this planet. And if you combine with those people, you are winning. No matter what they do, you are winning. And the key to it was understanding the diaspora. And that was a light bulb to me. With this flag that I have behind me, anybody who knows me knows for the past God knows how many years now, I always wear a piece of red, black, and green with me wherever I go. Always. And the reason why I do that is partly, in main part, because I want to pay tribute at all times to the people who came before me and paved the way for me through struggle, through achievement, through glory, through anything else. But by and large, it's gone to the point where my life has been shaped by these influences so much. I feel protected when I wear it, man. I feel conscious at all times. So I've talked to some Black people about this because they say, Jimmy, why are you always wearing the banner? Always, man. You've always got it with you. And when I explain, some Black people, they relate to the colors. You understand what I'm saying when I tell them what it means to me? But some Black people tell me, don't you think it's a little bit quaint or unnecessary? And stuff like this, and I think, well,
a lack of consciousness and a lack of spirituality. What we have, and it's disconnected from the ancestors.
You know what I mean? But I just say to people shamelessly, I've gotten so much. I've gotten so much from being a diaspora man, and I'm very proud of it. Yeah. And I've already told my sisters, if anything happens to me and when I die and I get buried, this is the colors I want to be wrapped with when I get buried.
Yeah.
This matters a great deal to me. It really does. And so coming back to Rastafari, right? It was this two-pronged thing. There was religion on the one hand, and there was this knowledge of self, culture, and political awareness. And I have to admit, I was going with the latter fully, you know what I mean? The 12 tribes of Israel, that presented itself as an opportunity a couple of more years down the line when I started hearing that friends, including Errol, were going along to Manchester and registering and signing up. And it was a whole new kind of like ball game then, because, the whole emphasis then was not on just kind of like, talking about Africa and talking about, worshiping the Most High. It was, you were signing a commitment to these things now. And I must confess, I didn't sign up with the 12 tribes myself. We called the organization Israel because the main driving force with signing up to the 12 tribes was that you were becoming a part of the exodus back to the promised land, to Africa. So you refer to Israel because you were, a member of the nation. You were somebody who considered yourself to be a part of that movement to move back to Africa. And while I had no issue with that, central to this was obviously the belief that, the emperor was the reincarnation of Christ. Not all Rastas, I have to say, believed this. There were various different types of Rastafarian, depending on which part of the world that you came from. And in Britain, there were basically two schools of thought. There was the Israel school of thought, which was the 12 tribes, obviously. And central to that was that Haile Selassie was the reincarnation of the Christ, okay?
No,
and like Errol,
everyone has a different views on that, but my thing as a Pan-Africanist,
okay,
I don't subscribe. I can understand the Black Liberation Movement because of a lost identity, and especially what's happened, especially how everyone was being treated growing up. But as a Pan-Africanist, I don't look at Israel as any holy land or promised land. I see Africa as the holy as holies.
Yeah,
and
yeah,
it's the first place of humanity. But that's the
yeah.
difference between religion and obviously, and also Africans have their own spirituality. You know, the new one divine creator from the beginning. You know, so.
Sure.
But don't get me wrong. Back then, people were in more of a search for an identity, and obviously, with me having Nigerian roots anyway, I knew exactly which part of Africa I was from. I knew my tribe, my geographical area. But like I say, I've always gravitated more to Pan-Africanism. But at the same time, I can recognize the Rasta movement as a liberation movement. No, I don't look at it like as a religious movement. I mean, it could be that, don't get me wrong, if you want to be that, but there's different sects there, Nyabingi, Babishanti, but I more gravitate towards the Pan-Africanism. But I could understand, probably if I was around back then, I probably would have joined the movement for the fact of all this racism. I mean, it's better to be a part of that than to be a part of looking at a white savior and the usual crap that you were getting taught in schools. But anyway, and this one goes back to another thing. Ever since I've been into me history and all different things, I've always connected to African history rather than just the word Black history. And that was basically, when we say Black history, we could be talking about anywhere. People in Papua New Guinea are Black. People in different places in the world are Black. Now, I know we are referring to Black as in the African diaspora, but I always felt that we have to have, Black has to have a more of a solid identity of where are you from. Basically, it has to have we understand, recognize a culture, you know, we recognize a continent with geographical area and much aspects that come with that. But a lot's changed over time. You know, you use that to really more dig deep to find your history. It wasn't like the internet like it was back then, you know, so it was more of a search for an identity. But like me, myself, like I always gravitate toward Pan-Africanism, and then I obviously started gravitating towards original peoples wherever we are on this planet. So anyway, back to what you were saying, and also your connection with Professor James, not James, Professor Stephen Small. James Smalls is another philosopher.
Sure.
Anyway, Professor Stephen Small, who I've had on my show 3 times now, and we have had great dialogues on many different topics. We've covered a lot, you know, and I hope to definitely link up with him again. It's been a great help and introduced me to some of the guests as well on my show, professors from Brazil, South Africa, you know, different places. So I salute him anyway, Professor Smalls, and I know you have a great connection, a great history with Professor Smalls. So you can tell us a bit about your connection, and I bet you've learned a whole lot of this man.
Stephen Small, you know, I can't say enough about him. You know, I'm very fortunate to know Stephen, and I'm very proud to say that we're very, very close friends as well as associates. You know, we talk a lot about personal matters together. You know, we try and solve each other's personal problems. You know, we are very, very good friends. That, you know, I have to say that. But I first heard about Stephen many, many years ago, back in the days when we were both Rastas. And one of the things that Stephen and I have in common back then is that we were both Rastas, by and large, motivated the same way. We were interested in, as you say, Rastafari as a liberation movement, okay? And the things that we got politically from that kind of drive. And I'd heard about Stephen, but it was more a curiosity thing, you know, because he wasn't around much when I first started hearing about it, because he'd already gone off studying in different places. So he wasn't in Liverpool that much. But I'd heard that he was one of these guys, you know, he was, you know, very, very clever. He was well educated in terms of, you know, getting a school education and going on to university and all the rest of it. And I was curious because not only was he Black, but he was a Rasta as well. And it nickled me, you know, what is a Rasta? Businessing himself with all that kind of stuff that's for white folks. You know what I'm saying? So I came across him. I encountered him in the Methodist Centre one night. He was just enjoying the reggae music. You used to have a Crasher sound system playing on a Friday night, every Friday, and you go there and listen to reggae music for a few hours. And Stephen was there one night, so I went up to him and introduced myself to him. And of course, he didn't know me, and he's a few years older than me. And I just started asking him these questions, and he said these really, really, you know, interesting things, you know, about, you know, what Black people can do for themselves if they empower themselves with knowledge. You know, he made the point, go through the system, get the qualifications, get the degrees and stuff, but make sure that when you are reading and the knowledge that you fasten yourself to, make sure it's Black. And I was like, well, where are you getting this Black knowledge from? He said, go to places like, in Black bookshops in London and Manchester and stuff like this. He was older than me. He could travel much more easily. So it was easy for him. I couldn't get these books the way he was saying, but he also suggested that, Elimu Anani, which had just opened up in the Methodist Centre, Wally Brown was running it. He had a good initial collection of Black books that I could get into. So I wasn't so sure at first at that point in time, but because I was more interested in the music and what I was getting from the music, you see. To me, that was so spot on. It was safe knowledge. But anyway, that's when I first met him. And that was that, basically. We had that conversation. And then over the years, I heard about all the things he was achieving, being in Berkeley and all the rest of it. And you grow up with a wiser head. And I'd already gotten myself a university education by this time as well. And I'm hearing that he's achieving all these great things. And by this time as well, I'd understood that a lot of the people that I admired who were active in America had actually attended Berkeley, and some of them had actually taught in Berkeley and lectured in Berkeley. And I thought, wow, our guy, man, he's teaching, to that level, Black and, African American as well. And I thought, this is a guy, who I need to meet him again, man. And I knew his brother Terry, his younger brother Terry. I know him for years. He was a Rasta too. And I was saying to Terry, listen, when's your kid over? I need to interview him. I need to speak with him. I've got ideas and I want to see what he thinks and stuff like this. And this is going back maybe about 5 years ago or so now. And of course, he wasn't over in Britain that often, so it was hard to get hold of him. But eventually, when he came over, there's a funny story around how we met, but it will take up too much time. But anyway, we met. Eventually, he was a bit wary of me. How come I knew so much about him, but he hadn't heard of me? But he was generous. He gave up a lot of his afternoon the following day. We went somewhere, we had coffee. He took a hell of a lot of notes. He's got this thing for taking notes. He's writing stuff down all the time as you're talking. And he interviewed me on the way back home as we walked through Princess Park. And I was supposed to be the one interviewing him. But then we decided we were going to keep in touch. When he went back to America, we were Skyping each other every couple of weeks or so. And then it got to the point where we were Skyping every week. And he realized, he said to me, listen, Jimmy, man, you know a hell of a lot of stuff about what's happened in Liverpool, activist-wise. Why aren't you writing? This question came up time and time and time again. And I'd always wanted to write. But my thing was, I'm busy with this. I'm doing that. I'm in the middle of this. I haven't got time. I do want to write, but I'm going to write one day. I'm going to write one day. So anyway, he cajoled me. He kind of like shook up this bet, early last year. He said, listen, I'm going to write 4 articles on Liverpool 8, right? And I want to see if you can match me and write 4 articles as well. And we'll have 8 articles standing for Liverpool 8. And we'll circulate them as a bunch of articles 8 articles about Liverpool 8. And he said, I bet you can't do it. He did me because he knew, okay, I'll admit a little something to you here, right? Me and him used to banter a lot. And I had a little bit of ego about it, So he knew that. And so he wound me up and he said, I bet you can't do it. So I said, I'll match you, man. No worries. So anyway... We basically wrote a number of articles together, and that ended up being the basis for the book that we came out with last year. But I have to say that man has done so much for me. His wealth of knowledge and understanding about the liberation struggle and most other aspects of kind of like, diaspora history and culture is phenomenal. He's helped me a great deal, in particular with my interest in the liberation struggle, outside of America and outside of the Caribbean. As you know, well and truly know, James, the man is an expert on, the struggle and racism and the diaspora parts in South America, in Europe, in other parts of the world where there's Black people, where no one else bothers to touch upon. I've been frustrated. You know yourself. I mean, personally, I've been frustrated over the decades because I wanted to know more about Brazil, Colombia, Cuba, all of these places. But when you go to reach for the books, they're in Spanish or they're in Portuguese. And
well, he can actually speak Spanish and Portuguese as well, can't he?
He's multilingual, man. People don't know this, but
big advantage.
Exactly. I don't know how he's managed to do it. You know, he can speak French, he can speak Spanish, he can speak Portuguese.
Wow.
You know, the man, and he's a tenured professor. You know, I don't know how he's managed to fit all this in. You know, but he's crammed a lot into his 60-odd years, and it's a true privilege for me to know him. And the other thing as well that I have to say before we move on is he's incredibly generous. It doesn't matter who you are; he doesn't have to know you. If you introduce yourself to him and you are from Liverpool and you're Black or African, it doesn't matter. What he won't tolerate is time wasting and nonsense. If you just let the sound of your own voice and you've got no purpose or direction with what you want, he's like anyone else. He'll tire of that. But if you are serious, if you have ideas, and you don't even have to have ideas that he agrees with, but if you are positive and you want to promote history of Black in Liverpool, he will help you any way he can. You know, that man has gone all the way with me, and he's helped me. He's even given me financial assistance and stuff like that. I'm not trying to suggest that he could do that with everybody. With personal friends, you understand. But he has never said no to me when I've asked him for anything. And I know he'll tell you that it's a two-way thing and that he gets a lot from me. But honestly, man, he's in recent years, he's given me a sense of direction, because I never had, or, you know, a lot of the things that I'm preoccupied in my mind that I want to engage with and achieve for myself now. And he's given me that impetus. You know, he's motivated me to write and promote our history to the extent that I'm trying to do now. You know,
he's a very serious researcher. Plus, as well, like he's told me himself that sometimes when he could be having these discussions with other professors with whatever PhDs he's got, and they're referring to him as if like, well, how do you know something? He'll just put it, look, I was Black before they had any PhDs, or I was a professor. You know what I mean? So you live the experience, and he doesn't forget the experience. And the fact that in the United States, where he's gone, which is totally a lot more thriving for Black history, you know, even African history, you know. So a lot of the studies in the United States, you know, they're well ahead of the UK, way ahead. You know, we got some researchers here and that, but a lot of the people who have studied a lot of history have actually came from the United States. I also look at some African researchers like Sheikh Anta Diop, you know, Theolophus Mabenga, and some others, Dr. Yoshi Ben Yakinen, but a lot of them seem to come from America, which they are more like, it's just thriving there a lot more. So he's in the right place, in the right space, you know. So, and he's definitely a person who helps a lot, you know. And like you say, if he sees you serious and trying to uplift our people, you know, I can see he's a person who definitely helps. He's helped me get on different people on my show from different places in the world and that, you know. So
he's really absolutely committed to that, James, and he's incredibly happy. You know, I don't want to get into the name mentioning thing, because ultimately the mistake you make when you do this is that you because of the way the memory works, you leave certain people out. But you know, there's a lot of people in Liverpool late who he's met, or he's been introduced to, or who he has on his tick list to meet when he comes back soon. He'll be visiting again reasonably soon, and you know, he's very, very, very pleased and impressed with the fact that, you know, there's so many people who are doing such positive things. You are obviously one of those people. He's told you so. I know this, and you know, he realizes that being away from Liverpool for so long, he's missed a lot in terms of how we developed in an activist sense as a community. And one of the things that he's really impressed with is that there are so many young people who are engaging in studying and promoting Black history in a plethora of many different ways, whether it be as out and out activists, as writers, as historians, as creatives, as poets, whatever the case may be. You know, people using an array of different skills, filmmaking, for example, film recording, interviews, you know, the sky's the limit. And he realizes that all this has been going on. And what he wants to do is he wants to help people, you know, to be able to engage in the ways that they want, you know, in any way that he can help. You know, and one of the most obvious ways, as you're benefiting from, James, is introducing some of the people who he's met over the years to the likes of yourself. You know, that is a hard thing to achieve on your own. And yet he's like a key to a door, you know. key to an exclusive doorway. And I just can't stress how prepared he is to help people who are serious.
No, definitely, definitely. Well, you know what? Anyway, Jimmy, you know, this has been a great discussion anyway. And I want to thank you very much for your time today. This is James Diboe, Discovering, dedicated to original peoples. And Jimmy, I want to give you the big thanks up for today. And it's been a pleasure. And, you know, I'm sure we'll link up in the future. And anyway, and I'll see you around.
I hope so.
Hopefully we can do another part 2 in the future anyway.
Yeah, man, absolutely. It feels like it's only been 5 minutes, and it's frustrating me really that we got to end, because, you know, I think we've only just started talking, to be honest, James.
Yeah, but we'll do a part 2 anyway. There's always continuation of this anyway. Well, thank you very much, Jimmy, anyway. That's a pleasure.